first Global Challenges to Democracy seminar of the semester. We've got a slate of really fantastic talks coming up, and we could not be more delighted and really honored with this first seminar, which is entitled "The Logic of the Future, Logic for the Future, International Relations in the Age of Turbulence." So just to introduce myself, my name is Jeane Gonzalez. I'm an assistant professor of public policy here at the Kennedy School, and the seminar series is co-organized with my colleague Gotham Nair as well. And so I'm going to start with just a few announcements before the discussion begins. First, the Ash Center acknowledges the land on which Harvard University sits as the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people, and we recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Mi'kmaq nations. One other housekeeping item: today's discussion is being recorded and will be made publicly available on the Ash Center's YouTube page. Now, we could not be more fortunate with our pair of guests that we have for today for the seminar. First of all, of course, we've got Stephen Heintz, who is the president and CEO of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, a private family foundation that advances social change for a more just, sustainable, and peaceful world. He has devoted his career to strengthening democratic culture and institutions, and before joining the fund in 2001, he co-founded and served as president of DEMOS, a public policy organization focused on reducing political and economic inequality and broadening citizen engagement in American democracy. Mr. Heintz also co-chaired the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship and co-authored its 2020 report, Our Common Purpose, Reinventing American Democracy for the 21st Century. Earlier in his career, Stephen Heintz served in leadership roles at the East-West Institute, working on civil society development, economic reform, and new security structures in Central and Eastern Europe. And in recognition of that work, he received the Officer's Cross Order of Merit from the President of Poland. What we're here to discuss today, or at least just a starting point, I think, for a much broader discussion, is the report, A Logic for the Future, International Relations in the Age of Turbulence, which is going to be a springboard for a broader discussion about U.S. foreign policy and the implications for global democracy and domestic democracy as well. And we are extremely privileged that Mr. Heintz' interlocutor for this conversation will be our own Meghan O'Sullivan, the Jeane Kirkpatrick Professor of the Practice in International Affairs here at the Kennedy School, as well as the Director of the Geopolitics of Energy Project and the Director of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs here at HKS. Meghan draws on deep experience in government, diplomacy, academia, and the private sector to inform public debate on issues at the intersection of geopolitics, energy, and national security. We'll get started first with a conversation between Meghan and Stephen for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you. And we're really looking forward to a wonderful discussion, so please help me welcome Stephen Heintz and Meghan O'Sullivan.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and thanks to the Ash Center for hosting us today for this conversation. And I'm always thrilled when centers work together to do important things. So I was particularly thrilled when you reached out to me and asked if I would join. And a big part of why I was excited about this as well was not just institutional, but was also because of the opportunity to see Stephen Heintz and to talk about a report that I believe was written in 2004, but really has a lot of...
23.
23, okay.
Yeah, 2023.
Okay,
yeah.
All right. I think it says June 2004. Anyway,
really?
You would know better than I, right? So I won't, I'll challenge you on other things. But yeah, in any case, what's really great about this report is I think since the time it was written, it's become even more valuable. And that is because for many reasons, but one of them is just the age of turbulence that Stephen talks about. You know, three big areas of rising geopolitical conflict, technological change, and environmental challenges, to make an understatement, you know, have only all intensified. But the thing I like most about the report is that you really are offering an alternative vision. So when I teach in my classes about the energy transition, I talk about scenarios that talk about where we are and where we're going. And then there's another kind of scenario, which is about where we want to be and what we need to get there. And you offer us where we might like to be. And I want to talk to you about where that is, but also how we might get there.
That's the hard part.
That's the hard part. So just in opening it up, you begin the report quoting Peter Drucker, who's a management expert, saying, the big crisis, the big mistake is to operate on old assumptions when tackling challenges or something along those lines.
Right.
And then you talk about some of the old assumptions. And I wondered if we could start there by asking you to describe a little bit about this old logic that you see, and whether or not you see some green shoots about some of those assumptions maybe being abandoned in favor of newer assumptions or newer logic.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Megan, and thank you for taking the time to have this conversation with me. I really appreciate it. It's great to see you again, and thank you all for being here. This is really a wonderful opportunity, and I really look forward to your questions and comments in a few minutes. I want this to be very interactive. Just to quickly tell you the origin of this paper, since you started there. So in 2023, I was offered a fellowship at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin. And it's a very generous program. You don't apply for it. Somehow they find you, and you wake up one morning and you see this thing in your inbox that you think is spam because the offer is far too generous. But
I'm still waiting for mine.
exactly. So I went to Berlin and I spent 5 months, and they say, come, devise a project of your choosing. We will support you in trying to do the project. They give you an office. There's a cohort of other fellows that was really quite extraordinary. And so I decided, we're in this period of enormous turbulence. We see that the post-war international system is no longer serving us well. It's showing signs of anachronism, of inefficiency, ineffectiveness, and in some cases, obsolescence, frankly. And it's time to think about an international system that will serve us better in the remaining decades of this center and produce less violent conflict, more broadly shared prosperity, and a sustainable planet. And, people would say to me in the fellows meetings that we had in Berlin, oh, that's an easy subject. You ought to get that, squared away in 5 months. And I knew it was kind of a quixotic undertaking, but I decided, what the heck? We need to actually encourage blue sky thinking at this point. And I was inspired by Hannah Arendt, who said, we are free to change the world and build something new in it. And I think that's where we are. I think we need to think very boldly about the future. Otherwise, we are in a very, very high-risk environment in the next few decades. In addition to the turbulence, there are 3 existential risks upon us. One is a renewed nuclear arms race, which we're now seeing in real terms. The climate crisis, in which we're already seeing, enormous economic losses of life, environmental devastation that is only going to get worse if we don't undertake the necessary mitigation steps. And in this country, we're backing away from the necessary mitigation steps. And the advent of hyper-disruptive technologies like agentic AI, but also biotechnology, that really have the dual reality of offering great promise for humankind and the planet, but also potentially enormous peril. So these 3 existential crises are happening simultaneously in a period that is already very, very turbulent. So the old logic, and if you just look at page 7, there's a graphic presentation of what I came up with. So I went back and I studied the origins of the existing international system and its evolution. So literally going back and rereading the Peace of Westphalia, the treaties, and looking at the Concert of Europe and the League of Nations, and literally going through the whole history of it. And from that, I tried to pull out what I see as the core elements of the logic that was behind that evolution of our international system. And then I interrogated each one of them to say, which ones of these do we want to keep in a logic for the future? Which ones do we want to retire in a logic for the future? Which ones should we revise? And what new concepts should we include. And I do think there are some green shoots. I mean, if you just look at the list, we are moving away from anthropocentrism. I think there is a much greater acknowledgement now that we need to be concerned about all life on this planet because we are interdependent with the other forms of life. And the biodiversity loss, which is both a moral failure, is also a high-risk failure because biodiversity provides many of the eco-services that sustain human life. So I think we are making some progress on that. I think we are making some progress on moving away from national sovereignty to more collaborative forms of sovereignty, not giving up national sovereignty, but thinking about how we can pool sovereignty. And, obviously the European Union is the best example of this so far. There are others that are emerging and need to be encouraged. So I think there's real strength in that. I think two areas where we're not making as much progress as we need to, and some of these are highly contested points, but one is moving away from neoliberal economics. I think we have got to a point where we have made profit and personal aggrandizement, greed, even if you want to put a short term to it, is now kind of the economic model, and we use GDP as the primary source of how we measure progress. And we are doing this at a time that is causing huge concentrations of wealth and power, and that is, I think, destructive to democracy. And we need to move away to what I'm interested in, which is an economics of human and planetary well-being. And that's not my term, it's a term that is being developed by scholars and academics and practitioners around the world. And that's one where I don't think we've made as much progress. And we can go into any of the other ones anybody's interested in. But so I think that the core answer is I do see some progress. I think it's too slow. And I'm hoping that by putting these ideas out into public debate, that it will help encourage people to think we need to move a little quicker in some of these things.
So I'm going to ask you a question that has a risk of being too abstract, but given what you have just put on the table, I can't resist. So when I think about the documents that you must have read, and I am intensely jealous
It was
of
so
the
much fun.
idea of sitting and reading these foundational documents. I bet you read Dean Acheson's
Absolutely.
Creation. This was a group of countries and even individuals over the course of history who were empowered to make decisions about the architecture for the global economy and for global governance. Now, who do you think is entrusted to develop a system that embraces your new logic?
That's the really complicated question. There isn't anybody who's really entrusted. And trust is really the word, I think. It was, of course, very interesting to see how responded to Prime Minister Carney's speech at Davos.
That's my next question.
Yeah, okay. And the two are obviously connected. At the end of after World War I, the U.S., because the U.S. had, in essence, come to Europe's saving, was entrusted with the notion. And so that helped give birth to the League of Nations, which, unfortunately, the U.S. caused to fail by not ratifying the treaty. At the end of the Second World War, it was really the U.S. again with the Brits, starting really with FDR's Four Freedoms speech in January of 1941, and then the Atlantic Charter with Churchill later in the summer, at a very, very dark time. This was after Hitler had taken over all of Europe. The U.S. was not yet even in the war. Britain was in a fight for its very survival. And these two leaders came up with a very visionary document that laid the groundwork for what became the United Nations. So I think, we are in a period where there is no hegemon. The United States' reputation around the world is not entirely positive these days for a lot of reasons we can get into. The United Nations is discredited in some ways, and what a friend of mine refers to as the the uninhibited middle powers are assuming, more territory on the global stage in terms of their aspirations and impact. So Mark Carney, speaking to the middle powers, offers one path, but there is not going to be one single path. I think it's going to have to be multiple things happening simultaneously in different venues with different empowered leadership that somehow at least signs up to the same set of principles, maybe, some idea of the same set of logic, a logic model.
I was going to ask you about Carney's speech, and I think we were both at Munich, where there was a lot of, this is the Munich Security Conference, which just ended last week, and in every conversation I was in, it was talk about Mark's speech and like middle powers and how viable is this as an alternative.
Yeah.
And what I read in your report, and then is echoed in the sentiments around, and why people found it so exciting, is that this idea that we can tackle problems by using these flexible alliances.
Exactly.
But
Messy though.
yeah, so I guess that's my question. Like, do you see that this creates the risk of fragmentation of the global order if there is all of these different groups with different objectives and flexible alliances, or is that just the future, even though maybe that's not the one most conducive to stability and progress, but that's the future? Like, what is the optimal versus the inevitable?
Yeah, I think it tilts more toward the inevitable. I think it is the reality of the future.
Yeah.
And it's not something we're going to be able to control. It's something we're going to have to influence and shape and on a continuous basis. It's not going to be fixed. It's not going to be permanent. There's going to be a lot of dynamism in this, which is going to require very nimble, policy, very nimble leadership, and it's going to be hard work. But I just think ultimately that's the reality. The fragmentation already exists, and so what we need to do is to create an ecosystem that manages the fragmentation and tries to prevent further fragmentation at a time when there are planetary risks.
So let's get to a few more concrete things in the building blocks. You lay out 10 building blocks and with some very specific and I think interesting and innovative descriptions. So let's talk for a moment about UN reform. So you talk about, you describe the UN as this beautiful old house in desperate need of repairs. And for those of us living in Cambridge, like this is a very familiar, living in a 1846 farmhouse. So the question is, where do you think that focus should be on in reform for the UN? And when you heard, I'm going to try to stir the pot a little, when you heard Secretary Rubio speak in Munich, he said, we're not trying to get rid of the UN, but the UN hasn't really been helpful in resolving any of our current problems. So the Trump administration, they might say, look, Stephen Heintz talked about how we need to supplement the architecture, and they form a board of peace.
I knew you were going to go there.
Yeah, exactly. It's screaming out.
No, it does. It does.
So, is this a geometry that might be constructive? Are some people too quick to criticize it?
No. I think the answer to that is clear because of the following thing. What we have in the UN as a major feature of the design is still great power dominance through the P5. What the Board of Peace offers is one power dominance. With Donald Trump as the chair, with Donald Trump holding veto power, with Donald Trump setting the agenda, with Donald Trump forcing other countries to pay the bill. And that is not the kind of substitute or supplement to the UN that we need. It could have been, theoretically, you could have,
it is
especially.
like authorized by a UN resolution.
Well, at least the Gaza, right.
The initial
exactly.
vision of it.
And the initial vision, if it had been designed and implemented to be less U.S. centric, might have been a good example of how to supplement the UN. But the original vision was, how are we going to manage Gaza in the future? How are we going to give the Palestinians voice and empowerment? How are we going to assemble the funds to rebuild and create a place that people will want to live and can live in dignity? And that could have been a good model. But instead, we got this narcissistic, and by the way, that's another part of the logic change, right, is going from what Hans Morgenthau called strategic narcissism to this notion of strategic empathy. And I don't think the Board of Peace demonstrates that, frankly.
Do you see a structure that would be the kind of supplementing of the UN that's useful?
An existing one?
An existing one, or can you give us an example of what you might think would be useful?
You know, I actually have seen, and in fact, our foundation has been involved in some very small ones. So just to give you a couple of very concrete examples, as I say, they're kind of tiny, but they were quite productive. So back in 2006, I believe, or 2005, Secretary General Kofi Annan appointed Finnish President or former President Martti Ahtisaari to try to negotiate a final status agreement between Kosovo and Serbia. And I had known President Ahtisaari in a previous life, and he was eager to get to work on that assignment, but because of the complexities of the UN budgeting process and the Fifth Committee, he had no funds. So I said, well, why don't we fund you as a startup? You know, and so we made a grant to an NGO that he had started in Finland, and that allowed him to get to work. And then the UN caught up with it and took over from there. So that's just a micro example of ways. And more recently, we funded some work in the UN Department of Humanitarian Affairs, where they had a person who was going into Afghanistan to try to negotiate humanitarian relief with the Taliban. But again, they didn't have the kind of authority or budget to hire additional consultants and make it more robust and effective and so forth. So we organized a small consortium of foundations to actually provide funds in order to do that. On the structural side, I think that the connection to some of the regional bodies is a way of organizing some of these things in the future. So let's say in Africa, with the questions of security on the African continent, the African Union, flawed and complex as it is emerging as a useful venue, and one could imagine helping build the capacity of the AU and helping to empower it to be the first destination for trying to resolve conflict on the African continent in coordination with the Security Council and the UN. And so those kinds of models, and ASEAN is also a pretty well-organized and effective institution in Asia, Southeast Asia. So I think the regionalization is an important element of this going forward.
And then sticking a little bit on this global governance, and then I'll turn to democracy as well. One of the recommendations you do make is saying retiring something called the trusteeship committee, which I bet many people in this room don't know exists. They exist from the UN. Yeah. But, interestingly saying, let's have a climate committee. And what I think you're acknowledging is that the COP, the Conference of the Parties, the annual climate talks are, important, have been constructive, but are insufficient for the problem. And so you propose a different kind of, or a supplementary kind of architecture there. How do you move to a place where there's more accountability? I think you're talking about, a world in which countries are held accountable for not reaching climate goals. Which to me takes us back to Kyoto, which failed because, the situation is very different now, but it failed because countries didn't want to be held accountable, and so that it was
including the United States of America,
especially the United States of America, right? So there was this big innovation to move to nationally determined, contributions, which would be voluntary in nature. So it's just like peer pressure. I agree with you. If we could move the system there, but how do we do that? Like, how can we get into a world of accountability?
And that certainly highlights the larger question of accountability and impunity in international affairs, right? So including, for example, the violation of national sovereignty or the violation of international humanitarian law. And we have the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, but their enforcement mechanisms are also pretty weak. So it's a broad question about accountability and impunity. And I do think, though, that taking the climate example, I think if we were to convert the trusteeship council to a climate council, reporting directly to the General Assembly, which represents every nation, might actually highlight the accountability. And maybe it leads to some actual accountability structures. Right now, the accountability is largely done through civil society and journalism, in a way. And this was, the cops are places, when they work their best, they are places of polylateralism, where you have governments, you have the business sector, and you have civil society. And out of that comes something that moves the ball forward. And Paris was probably the best example. Yeah. But it's been civil society largely, and journalism, that have held countries accountable to their, national commitments. And we know that some have done pretty well and some have fallen behind, but that stuff, that kind of public naming and shaming is useful, but we got to make it a little bit more powerful.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Let me take us to the democracy question. This is the Ash Center for Democracy. And this is, as was mentioned earlier, this is a topic that you have worked a lot on over the course of your career. And since you wrote the report, the democratic landscape in the United States has changed considerably.
Dramatically.
And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about, you say in the report that even well-established democracies need reforms, like not least of all the United States. And this was back in 2003.
Yeah.
And so how have you seen the crisis intensify? Do you see prospects for those kinds of reforms that you were thinking of? And have you looked at other initiatives? So Jay Johnson chaired, we had him come speak about his initiatives, and a lot of them were recommendations that we all know would be good for our system, but we can't quite figure out how to do them.
Yeah.
So could you speak a little bit about that intersection between American democratic health and the overall logic of the future?
I'm not sure I can speak a little bit about it, but I'll try.
I'm willing to forego my expert and open up after we finish here, and then if we have time, I'll come back to it.
So if there is a through line in my entire career, it is democracy. I was a graduate of another major university on the East Coast. And the year I graduated from Yale, I decided to run for office. And I ran for the state senate in Connecticut, and not surprisingly, I was clobbered. But it was a fantastic experience, and I got offered a job pretty much the very next day after my defeat by a person who was going to serve as the Senate Majority Leader in Connecticut, and his name was Joseph Lieberman. So I worked for him, and then I worked for two successive governors in 15 years in very senior positions as a very young person, two cabinet offices. And then I went to Eastern Europe right after the fall of the Berlin Wall and worked all over Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union for the first decade of the transition for communism. And it was because I was inspired by the democratic impulse and the democratic resurgence in Eastern Europe, and feeling like I could learn from what was happening there, and I could be re-inspired to come back to America and reinvest in American civic life. So democracy has been an inspiration for me literally since I was 10 years old. And it was John F. Kennedy that was the source of my inspiration, since we're sitting here at the Kennedy School. I was in the third grade in 1960, and I just got excited about the presidential campaign and John Kennedy. So American democracy is a remarkable phenomenon. It is a marvel, and it is precious. It is flawed, it is challenging, it's complicated, But we need in this 250th anniversary year to recognize how valuable this is, and we need to reinvest in thinking about how do we make this democracy function effectively, again, for the challenges we face in the future. And we know our democracy has never lived up to the founding aspirations. And this year is a hinge year, in my view, that will determine whether we will have the future opportunity to try to achieve those aspirations or whether we will lose the chance. Because if we do not have an open, participatory, free, fair election in which everybody who wants to vote can vote and in which all the votes are counted accurately and in which we agree to the results, we may lose the opportunity for the future. So this is the year, in my view, where we need to defend the democracy we have in order to have the opportunity to create the democracy we need. So, and that, the work that I did, by the way, with Danielle Allen, some of you I'm sure have studied with Danielle or worked with Danielle. Danielle was also a co-chair of this American Academy Commission on Democracy. And the work we did with a very diverse commission, including ideological diversity, produced 31 very specific recommendations about how to improve American democracy. And we have been working together ever since. It came out in 2020. And we agreed that we would work together to the 250th anniversary this July on trying to advance the implementation. And it's not happening in Washington for obvious reasons, but it is happening in states and in cities around the country on some of the recommendations. So there is, there are incremental gains. Is it as fast or as deep or as comprehensive as we would like it to be? No. But and I think the future of American democracy is going to be determined from the bottom up, not from the top down. And that's what we're seeing. So if we can get through this year in the way that I've described, I think the opportunity to build the democracy we need is going to be with us. And that will be the work of all of us and the responsibility of all Americans, all citizens, to be part of the process of developing that democracy.
So in your response, which I really appreciate, you focus a lot on elections, which are obviously the crux of democratic systems, but they're not the only component of a democratic system. And so your recommendations, do they go, can you speak a little bit more about the non-electoral part of the democracy, which is so important? As a person who went to Iraq and we focused a lot on elections, but, there wasn't the kind of the democratic foundations that, that are now kind of coming to the forefront. It's 20 years later.
Yeah, I had the same experience in Eastern Europe. The impulse was, let's help these countries move very quickly to free and fair elections and functioning parliaments and institutions and processes. And they did. It was kind of amazing how fast that happened, right? But what was missing ultimately was the cultivation of a democratic civic culture. Because democracy is not just elections or institutions, it's really a way of living. It's a way of solving problems and overcoming division. It is a culture, and John Dewey said it was a civic faith. And we don't tend to that as much as we need to. So one of the recommendations in the report, Our Common Purpose, was to create a trust for civic life, which is up and operating now, and it's a vehicle that is aggregating national level philanthropic capital and making pretty small grants to citizen-led civic activity in rural and small-town America. And we have raised a total of about $50 million, I think, somewhere around that now. And we have a really extraordinary team of community leaders who are working in partnership with civic organizations in small-town and rural America and making grants to support their work. And these are citizens who just come together and say, you know what, I'm tired of the park down the street being such a mess, and why don't we all get together and figure out a way to clean up this park and get the city involved or the town involved so that in the future it doesn't deteriorate, or the library, needs something, or whatever it might be, and people come together, whether they're red or blue or white or black, and just say, we got to solve this problem. But they need a little support, and they need to know that others are doing the same kind of work in other places that they can learn from and be inspired by. And so this Trust for Civic Life, which has only been operating for 2 years, has already made grants in 35% of America's rural counties. And you can find Trust for Civic Life, obviously, on the web. And I think that's a really important part of it. Another one is something called Citizen University, which the third co-chair of our commission leads, Eric Liu. And Eric's work is also about creating the kind of rituals, the kind of community gatherings, the kind of celebrations of democracy at the community level that also enhance civic culture. And as a follow-on to the main report of that commission, we also published a report last year called Habits of the Heart and Mind, which is also available on the web, that really talks about other ways to deepen the civic culture of America, because we were convinced that, yes, there are institutional reforms that are absolutely necessary in this country, and we offered a whole bunch of them, including, term limits for the Supreme Court, and ranked choice voting, and universal voting, and, a whole bunch of the kind of technical, institutional, and procedural things. But we also said we really have to highlight the need to strengthen American civic culture, and we offered 3 or 4 things. And then the other one, of course, was about the information environment.
Speaking of Supreme Cort,
Yeah,
interesting
pretty interesting.
decision
Yeah.
this morning, so.
Yeah,
but
important.
I stray.
Yeah.
Maybe someone else will ask about that.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you about your US China recommendation, about Iran, about other things, but I'm going to open it up. And if we have time, I'll ask you about them. If we don't, that's because we'll have a lot of animated discussion. So thank you for that exchange.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, let me see who in the audience would like to take the conversation forward. And if you could please just say a line or two to introduce yourself to Stephen.
Yeah, hi, Stephen. I'm a Houghton postdoctoral fellow at the Asher Center, and I study Chinese politics and political economy.
Excellent.
And I'm really right now focusing on China's tech innovation, in AI and semiconductors. So I have a question I think is fascinating. Like in your report, you mentioned about establish a U.S.-China secretary. So can you but I think the two countries right now really have this race mentality. And the approach of, based on my research on China, the approach to govern AI is really what I call a speed over restraint. They're really focusing on speed.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I think collaboration and cooperation is really important, especially to prevent any risk and to improve safety of AI for all human mankind. So can you give some suggestion on that,
Thank you.
The two countries should do?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I've had the really good fortune of going to China frequently since 1979, when I had my first visit. And for the last 12, and the foundation has a major grant-making program in China that is focused exclusively on climate change. And as a result of that, 12 years ago, I was appointed by the Chinese government to serve on an international advisory body called the China Council on International Cooperation on Environment and Development, which is a very senior level. The vice premier chairs it, and all the relevant ministers of the Chinese government serve on it, along with the international members. And it's quite serious. So my thoughts about China really are the product of having been pretty deeply engaged in China for quite a few years. Obviously, and as I say it in the paper, and I'm not the first person to say this is the most consequential bilateral relationship of this century. How this relationship goes will determine how this century turns out, and well into the future, beyond this century. And it's not going that well these days. It's very episodic. It seems to lurch from one moment of tension to another for a period because of circumstances like the espionage balloon. We had very little contact, and then after a year of very little contact, we began to have high-level contacts again. But it always seems very episodic. We obviously have a big and important embassy in Beijing. I had breakfast with Nick Barnes this morning, our excellent former ambassador in Beijing. But I really feel like this relationship is so important that having a secretariat where you second professionals from the key ministries to sit and work together on a daily basis and to learn from each other and to understand each other and to explore red lines and to explore ideas and to communicate back to the capitals would be an additive capacity to this really important relationship. And I really agree with you that AI and technology, climate is these two are the ones that both demand cooperation and where cooperation could bring mutual benefit. And we just need to be determined to help that to happen. And I think having this kind of a secretariat might be one way to help advance that kind of what I would refer to as constructive competition, because we know we're going to compete. And competition is not all bad. It depends on what it leads to. But we need to help channel it to be constructive competition. And in the realm of AI, as you say, the history of human engagement with technology has been a history of rapid adoption and very little restraint, with only nuclear as the prime example of where we as a global community decided this massive power, we needed to exercise some restraint and some control. And AI is the next generation of that kind of power. And unless we figure out a way to exercise both restraint and to establish some norms and some regulation, we face the prospect of a very, very perilous future. And the U.S. and China have a lot to gain by trying to cooperate in doing this, I think.
I would add to that, I agree, and I found this one of the very interesting recommendations, given the importance of these two things you talked about. Also now on U.S.-China on nuclear proliferation.
Yes, definitely.
Like that's, now that China has become much more capable and in this domain, I think it's another area
You're right.
for
You're right.
conversation. So I'll start here.
Me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Juan Cruz. I'm an MBA ID student. I'm from Colombia. First, thank you for this fantastic report. But I wanted to go a little bit deeper on this 12 core elements, especially into very specific dilemmas in international relations that I think that it's important to understand how can we achieve it in this new understanding of the international order. The first one is migration, that I think it's a false dilemma between two main principles. And the problem is that the people that are struggling around the world because of conflict and other social issues are in the middle. So how can we address this specific dilemma with these core principles? And the second one is the hard part in international relations is even though we have all these principles, we have all the system that it's organized to solve all our cooperation and have a better global order. We have example as Venezuela, that the international system failed. Venezuela. And so my question is, how can you balance this international order with this type of situations where the reality is that the principle of the responsibility of protect reclaimed the place of the international order? And even though it's an important principle, it could be, it has a threat to be utilized by power to do other things that really getting into the core of the problem.
So R2P specifically, or the responsibility to
So
protect?
my question is, the people have argued that the actual action of the U.S. in Venezuela could be argued as a motto of responsibility of protect the people because the Venezuelan government failed their people.
Right.
But I think that there's a threat that actual power can take advantage of this principle to just achieve their national interests going forward from a real important interest, a global interest. So my question would be, how can we balance that order? And how can we include this type of principles to avoid affecting that power relationship that can affect the global?
Yeah. A very complicated question, obviously. And I don't presume to have a particularly convincing answer, frankly, because I think it is so complicated and I think there's so much work that needs to be done on this. The establishment of the right to protect notion, which was developed over a period of years, was an important conceptual step forward. In application, it's proven to be not as effective as the framers of it had hoped. Libya is a very good example of how it kind of went bad. Venezuela, was, I don't think I would even put it in that category. It was really about national interests of the United States. And it was not authorized by the Security Council, which the right to protect, envisioned that if a nation was not taking care of its people or was actually subjecting its people to violence or massive abuses of human rights, that the Security Council could authorize an intervention on behalf of the people. And obviously that didn't happen in the case of Venezuela. And not to make light of this, but I have a very dear friend who is Venezuelan, now, of course, living in this country for a long time. And his assessment of this was, well, they took out Alibaba, but they left the 40 thieves. And so is life really going to get better for the Venezuelan people, or is the United States going to have access to more oil? And I'm simplifying, of course. So we need to get to a mechanism whereby we can implement principles like the right to protect in a way that reflects consensus. And so, again, looking at the Venezuelan case, could we imagine that at some point in the future, the Organization of American States would have greater capacity and would be empowered to, in essence, represent the Security Council and be the place to determine whether or not the gross violations of the rights of the Venezuelan people demand that the OAS authorize action to give the Venezuelan people the opportunity for a different future. But I don't think that's a perfect answer. I don't have one. But that's the kind of problem I think we need to really think through.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you for your time. So my name is Hailo. I am an MA candidate at the Kennedy School. I'm from Tigray, northern Ethiopia. So my question would be, with this logic that you are proposing, why do you think the superpower will come to the table? After the Second World War, this order that we are having now, benefits them well, serves them well. Yeah. Is there any, push or pull factor that's going to, help us bring them to this table?
Bring who?
The
superpowers? Yeah.
Or are we just, relying on moral values or some kind of divine intervention? So this is my first question. My second question, and which I disagree with you, is on the African Union.
Yeah.
I don't think the African Union is useful. We said it's useful, it's becoming useful, but I don't think it's useful. In fact, my take is it's useless.
Useless, okay.
Because when you look into what's happening in Sudan, when you look into what's happened in Tigray, in my home region,
yeah.
when you look into what's happening in Madagascar, the African Union has not even spoke about all of these things. They couldn't even denounce a coup d'etat. So I don't see them as a useful institution. Yes, they can be, a connecting point, but I don't see them as an institution. How do you come to that? Useful.
So let me turn the question back to you in a way. Could you imagine a process that would make the African Union more useful? And what would the elements of that process be? And then I'll get to your other question.
Well, to be honest, the African states has to be first committed to the cause of the African Union and to the standards or beliefs of what any multilateral organization should have. They first have to commit themselves, commit budget. For example, they rely 60% of their budget on the European Union.
Yeah.
So what do you think is going to happen when you have donors that pay everything for you? So I think the institution is, to be honest, dysfunctional. So I don't have this fix it all for the time being, but the first thing is stand alone than, the United States coming together, living to the standards of any organization.
So then I think the question becomes twofold. One is trying to help build capacity in the African Union for effectiveness. And as you suggest, it's a big challenge for a lot of reasons, including the fact that many of the member states are authoritarian states. The other is to think about whether there are coalitions of the willing in Africa that could be also empowered to intervene collectively in certain instances with the UN standing with them. And that's an alternative model. And I also think that in some ways, some competition in this evolution will be useful. So some models that are kind of ad hoc and short-term and coalitions of the willing, to use that term, up against the existing structural frameworks, because that can be a way of A, making some progress, and B, forcing some change in the competing institutional frameworks. It's not a perfect solution, but I think it's again, it kind of follows the reality principle. This is the world we're living in, and we need to find ways to move it forward, and we need to maybe try some parallel tracks. On your larger question about the superpowers, Weinstein and I talked about this morning too. He asked me more or less the same question, and the challenge we've got is that we haven't seen in modern history very many important examples of acting preemptively by the major powers. The UN was created responsively to massive destruction and war, which left Europe in tatters, and the United States is the hegemon, and so the UN was a response to that war and the war that had preceded it, and the hope that it would prevent another war. We're at a place where the turbulence and the existential threats that we face have the potential to create even more devastation than the Second World War. And the question is, can we act in advance to prevent that, or are we stuck in this human experience of only being able to act out of complete destruction? And I hope that we can work our way to the point where the superpowers see that it is in their interest and it is in global interest to act in advance of what disaster awaits us if we do not. But it's a big ask, it's a big demand, and it won't happen without a lot of pressure. And this is where I think the middle powers actually can be very useful, is actually exerting more pressure, and where we have to recognize, and one of the modest things that I have in this paper is the notion about the global majority. We refer to the global south, and it's a complete misnomer, because the countries that we normally assign to the global south, most of them live, the population live above the equator, so they're really not in the south. And they're not the minority of the global population. They are 80% of the world's population. And so I really think we need to give them the status they deserve and not think of them, the global south, but the global majority. This is the majority of our, planetary citizens. And so empowering them more and creating a more equitable distribution of power is ultimately in the superpowers' interest. But getting superpowers to act that way is a huge challenge. And so democratic debate, going back to our conversation about democracy, and I hope that in the 2028 presidential campaign, for example, that we will see some candidates coming forward with different visions about America's role in the world as a superpower, because it's essential. It is absolutely essential. And I say in the paper, we've had the kind of reflexive habit of thinking of ourselves as the dominant power and as the essential power. And I think we need to break that habit and think of ourselves as an essential power and an indispensable partner, as opposed to being the indispensable country. And that's a huge mindset shift in America. And political leadership is going to have to help Americans get to that point, because political leadership created the mindset we've got. which is the superpower, dominant power mindset. So I'm interested in how that debate is going to play out in the next presidential campaign.
What's so interesting, I can't help just respond very briefly as well to your
You probably have a
comments.
better answer.
No, not at all. But what is so fascinating is you said, oh, the superpowers have really benefited from the system, so why would they change it? The reality is that actually, I don't know who we're calling a superpower, but if we say China, the US, I mean, Russia in some formulation, the EU, the EU seems the only one really invested in this current international order.
Right.
And the really shocking thing about the United States right now is you do have a global hegemon dismantling its own sources of power in the international
That's
system.
true.
And so it does create at least an opportunity in terms of great fluidity. And your point, I think, is exactly right. Will anything good come of it? You know, will it be a spur to create something new, or
Exactly.
just, a fragmentation of
chaos.
the
Right.
order? Yep.
Yeah.
Here, please.
Thank you so much. Hi, I'm a student at the Kennedy School. I'm an MPP1. My interest is in how governments can work together to solve shared challenges through cross-border collaboration and economic cooperation, or the other way around. But I wanted to ask whether if you think that the current international system is facing turbulence because of institutions like the UN and WTO, whether if it's because their failure to constrain great power competition, or if you think they were just never kind of set up to accommodate for the world that we live in this multipolar world where power is diffused. So in other words, like, do you think it's as a result of institutional failure, or do you think it's because of institutional design? And I ask this question because, your report focuses a lot on reform, but why not replace? Like, why not think about replacement? Replacing of institutions that do, that can accommodate for this new world order that we live in. Obviously, I know that's not easy to do, but in the spirit of kind of like thinking boldly about the future,
Absolutely.
did you think about that?
I did, and I want to actually think more about that because, and one of the things, by the way, so, this, as I said, was the product of 5 months of work, and I know it needs a lot more work. So I'm getting ready to retire at the end of June from full-time leadership of an institution, and one of the things I'm thinking about doing is actually making this into a book and really digging deeper into the various elements here and making it more contemporary to where we are today, even a couple years later. So, but to your question, I think probably it's going to be a mix of the two. Certainly the design is no longer appropriate to the present, right? Because the world has changed dramatically since 1945. And unfortunately, in the UN Charter, like the US Constitution and the European Union Treaty, the amendment process is really, really hard. We made it by design to be very difficult. And so really reforming the UN is, on the fundamental things, is very, very difficult. So we probably will have to invent some new things. And that's part of this notion of supplementing the UN, creating an ecosystem around it where we do invent new things. And ultimately, if we invent some things that are successful, let's say, going back to the prior question, that we actually help the African Union become an effective regional body over time, maybe that helps us then to have both the power coming from the regions of the world to actually transform the UN to what it needs to be for the 21st century. Or we decide ultimately that the UN is less and less relevant, at least in certain spheres. In the peace and security, it was established because of the peace and security imperative. And, there were some really good examples over the UN history of how it functioned well in moments of crisis in that domain. That is not the case anymore. It's functioning pretty well in some other things. And so maybe we figure out new ways and divide the labor and responsibilities a little bit differently by both reforming and inventing at the same time.
Yes, please.
I'm Nargis Kasyanova. I run a program on Central Asia at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Thank you so much for this. I think it's great that somebody's working on a vision. I think we do need a vision badly in these dark times. I have two questions. One is following up on what the gentleman from Colombia asked about the migration. You didn't talk about migration.
Right.
It seems a very formidable challenge, and it seems there will be more migration, and migration is fueling sort of illiberal trends, authoritarianism, and all that. And it seems that there will be the birth rates in poorer countries are high. Climate changes will also be creating kind of these migration waves. What would be a good way of regulating these processes, in your view? And the second question is about liberal democracy. You talked about democracy, but democracy doesn't have to be liberal, right? But I guess people in this room, we are sort of more in that vein. So what are the prospects of liberal democracy, given that it is on the offensive now, and the kind of the cultural foundations, I would say, are sort of dissipating? So what are your views on the prospects?
So these are really big questions. So you're right, I kind of ducked the migration question, partly because it's just so hard, but I will say a couple of things about it. First of all, both of you are absolutely right. We're in a period of, enormous movement of people around the world, the largest, movement of people probably in human history at this point. And it's going to get worse for all the reasons we know. So, just from a common sense point of view, the first thing I think we need to be trying to do collectively is helping people stay home, because people don't want to leave. People really, they want to leave to escape unbearable conditions. But if the unbearable conditions were eliminated, they want to stay in their homes. They want to stay in their countries, in their cultures. It's not like they are leaving, because they're happy where they are. They're leaving because they're unhappy and threatened where they are by various things. So reducing the causes of migration is a major part of the future solution. Second is the appropriate regulation of migration, because it is hard for countries to absorb, and both economically, socially, politically, and so there has to be a more rational approach to how we absorb people who are forced to move or choose to move. And, we need a really big immigration reform effort in this country that secures the border from illegal migration and provides a real path for legal migration and for providing people with hope and opportunity. And we need it in this country. Just from the plain view of demographics and economics, we need immigrants to help us in the future. So helping people stay home, helping people come in a rational, organized way, diffusing the politics of this a little bit. Immigrants have become the victims of a culture war, at least in this country, but I'm pretty sure it's true in some of the European countries as well. And I think we have to diffuse that, because it is based on racism and discrimination and old patterns of thinking. And Meghan mentioned Secretary Rubio's speech in Munich, and I think one of the really disturbing aspects of that speech was that he kept referring to Christian civilization, and of course we also knew that he was really referring to white Christian civilization in a room in Munich, Germany, where the Nazi movement had started, which led to the Holocaust, with Christians in the audience, yes, but Jews and Muslims and non-believers in the audience as well, and people from all over the world. To me, it was chilling and very appalling moment, to be quite honest. That's the political and cultural absorption problem. If we have a politics that is based on civilizational Cold War, which I took his speech to be kind of a declaration of civilizational Cold War, then we are going to exacerbate the migration problem. If we can treat each other in accordance with the UN Charter on Human Rights with equal dignity, and then work out a system that, respecting that dignity, helps people achieve the lives they want, either in their original homes or elsewhere, we'll build a better future. That's what we've got to try to work toward. I don't have the knowledge base or the experience to suggest the specific elements of that, but I think that's the vision we need to work for and figure out those elements.
We just have 2 minutes, but I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question right here. You had your hand up.
I am from Horn of Africa, and I had some background in connection with UN reform, AU's demands, and so on and so on. Now, of course, I'm not in favor of granting veto powers to Africa or anyone. I mean, I'm in favor of democratic and constitutional global governance kind. My question is in connection with Trump's proposal, for example, Board of Peace. I sympathize with that proposal. I mean, when we see the trend, the UN is malfunctioning. Actually, it has been a while, for a decade and more. What alternative? I mean, the important principle, for example, sovereign equality, I mean, that is frustrating things. I mean, states with little interest, with no contributions at all, and so on and so on, and come and sit and frustrate decision-making and so on. So what alternative? I mean, the international law, international relations, they do not say interested states contributing, states coming with values, and they don't do those things. And what alternative? For me, I sympathize. I mean, the Gaza crisis, Ukraine, the UN cannot do much. So what alternative specific proposal can we think of, considering the impossibility with the UN?
You touched on this a little bit earlier when I asked about it, but if you've got any additional and closing thoughts, we're in that moment.
Okay.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Well, I think this whole piece of work was designed to try to start finding an answer to that large question. The system we've got is failing us. What is the system we might imagine that would do a better job to solve these global problems that we've got? I do think, as I said earlier, the Board of Peace could have been an example of supplementing the UN effectively, but it was designed with the wrong impulse and the wrong motivations. It was really about a new way of reinforcing U.S. power in the Middle East, and in particular, the aspirations of the current U.S. president, with very little institutional engagement in that. The U.S. Congress had nothing to say about it. Even the State Department had very little to say about it. The National Security Council, these are all institutions, Meghan has worked in them, that have been hollowed out and ignored largely in most of the Trump administration's foreign policy initiatives. And that, to me, is a very dangerous concentration of power, not only in one country, but literally in the hands and mind of one person. So the alternative is institutional. The alternative is collective. The alternative is equitable and participatory, and that's what we have to move toward, those principles.
That is a great point on which to end. I want to thank you so much for taking your time to come and visit us here. Thank you for this thinking and for painting a picture of a future that we can all aspire to and work towards. So please join me in thanking Stephen.
Thank you all very, very much. Really appreciate it. Great.
I am going to sign for you.
Please do.
Report on